Let's start at the commanders, and it's quite interesting. The 54th Division has been a challenging one to research. There's no divisional history. There's some good primary source material out there, but nothing really much above war diaries, etc. Of course, what is the first place to look for a historian? Wikipedia, of course. Now, what is quite interesting is there's some really well-known commanders who were commanding the 54th Division. First of all, in 1910, Sir Julian Byng, who became Canadian Corps Commander of Vimy Ridge fame and went on to become post-war Governor General of Canada. Also Major General Charles Townsend, interesting character, a bit of a playboy in his younger days, constantly showing off his brilliance in order to seek promotion. And he went out actually to relieve Gordon of Khartoum. Later, unfortunately for his career, he was captured at Kut al-Amara in 1916. He thought he would come back to a hero's welcome. Unfortunately, his career was almost but over at that stage. We have Major General Francis Inglefield. He was a very experienced general, especially throughout the Anglo-Boer War period, and he was actually commanding the division out in Gallipoli. One of their divisional commanders actually post-Gallipoli in 1916, all the way through to 1918, was Major General Sir Stuart Hare. I don't know if any of you come across him, but he was actually the brigade commander for the Lancashire Fusilier 86th Brigade landing at W Beach, the 6 VCs before breakfast. So quite a few names there that some of you may be familiar with. So what was the East Anglian Division? And to begin with, it was a territorial division, which was formed around 1908 during the army reforms under the Secretary of State for War at the time, Richard Haldane. And the 54th Division was one of 14 across peacetime UK at that time. Of those 14, 4 of those territorial divisions went to Gallipoli. The 54th, East Anglian, we're talking about tonight, the 53rd Welsh, the 52nd Lowland, and of course the 42nd East Anglian Division. You can probably also include in there the 2nd Mounted Division as well, which went out to Suvla a little bit later on. And there in front of you, you've got the order of battle as it stood there in 1910. It changed a little bit later on. So, of course, the East Anglian Division spanned East Anglia. For those who don't know where it is or less familiar, it's predominantly the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. And they form the major battalions of the division, but also from the East Midlands area. So you have the Cambridgeshire battalions, the Bedfordshire battalions, and the Hertfordshire battalions as well. In 1910, it had its full complement of artillery. So 4 brigades, 3 of those were field gun batteries, so typically 13 or 18 pounders. There was a battery of howitzers, and also 60 pounders in there as well, sort of part of the RGA. We mustn't forget some of the support units, the Royal Engineers, of course, the Army Service Corps and the Royal Army Medical Corps. And this sort of gave the full complement to the division prior to the First World War. So in 1910, this is what the 19th Division, beg your pardon, the 54th Division actually looked like, and there's a few changes in there I'll talk about in a few minutes. The divisional sign you can see on the left-hand side, which represents a blown out umbrella, which was adopted by the division at the time, or just after the time of what was called the Umbrella Hill Raise in July 1917. And the idea, I believe, was put the wind up the Turks, hence the word Umbrella Hill, and also the divisional sign. One rumour I did hear was it was actually chosen to reflect the number of venereal disease cases in the division during Egypt prior to going to Gallipoli. I don't know how true that is. And of course, I know nothing about the umbrella test, which I think some men probably still fear when they go to the clinic. Whilst they didn't use this sign in Gallipoli, they did use a variation of brigade coloured signs, maybe predominantly different squares, triangles, rectangular signs in yellow and red, and a variation of those two. For example, I think it was the 5th Bedfordshire Regiment, the 1st 5th Bedfords, had a yellow triangle, which was based on the biscuit tin cutout they used in the back of their packs in the attacks at Suvla. The triangle reflected the sun and actually shone yellow, so they believed that was a good omen, and they used that for their unit sign going forward. As war broke out, some of the best divisions, or sorry, best battalions of the division actually left the 54th Division. Sorry, I put my new tongue in back again. Of those, the 1st Hearts Regiment left, and they went on to fight during the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. The 1st Cambridgeshire Regiment as well, they fought in December 1914 at Givenchy and went on to fight in the Second Battle of Ypres. And the division also lost the 1st 4th Suffolk Regiment that joined the Indian Division on the Western Front. And these were replaced, as you see from this order of battle, by the 1st 10th, the 1st 11th Londons, which came from the 56th, I believe, London Division, and also the 1st 8th Hampshire Regiment, otherwise known as the Isle of Wight Rifles. It wasn't going to be the only change. All the divisional supporting elements, the essential services, the artillery, the engineers, the Army Service Corps, and Royal Army Medical Corps were deemed to be surplus and would not be needed at Gallipoli, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. The 54th Division would be in probably a worse state when it landed at Suvla Bay, so it wasn't only just lacking those units, it was also lacking some of its transport personnel as well, i.e. its wagon transport and horses. So everything from the landings onward would need to be carried by hand. It's also probably worth pointing out, I'll explain why in a few minutes, that every single battalion of the 54th Division, which pre-war would have been around 1,100 men, was way below that limit, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So what looks like on paper a solid division wasn't necessarily the case when they landed at Suvla Bay in August 1915. Reforms in 1908 abolished the various volunteer and militia units which existed around the UK at that time, and they were brought together and they were brought together into what were to become these 14 different territorial divisions. Before the war, you would have typically the 1st and 2nd Battalion. They would be regular soldiers. One would be serving at home and one typically serving abroad, more often than not in India. And you'd also have a 3rd Battalion, which were the reserve battalion for those first two. So when the changes happened during the Haldane reforms, the volunteer battalions at the time, for example, the 1st Volunteer Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment became the 4th Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment. The 2nd Volunteer Battalion became the 5th Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment and took the territorial title 1st 5th. The territorials themselves actually took great pride in their previous reputation of being crack shots with the rifle, a skill they had proven during the South African Boer War between 1900 and 1902. And they were really renowned for their sharpshooting skills. However, the primary role of the territorials, if war ever erupted, was going to be home defence primarily. So they would be the troops at home defending the British Isles, whilst the regular divisions would then go overseas in an expeditionary force. Volunteers were actually asked in 1914 if they wanted to join foreign service or imperial service, as you see from the badge there. And they were given the white badge for those who volunteered. As the demand for manpower was so huge, whole territorial battalions actually volunteered for overseas service. So very, very few men didn't volunteer. And that left a lot of the battalions very, very short of men. And one of the explanations is why when the 54th Division landed at Suvla, they were way under their 1,100 number, and they're more likely around 500 to 600 per battalion, so almost half strength. They were called Saturday night soldiers, During July 1914, so just before the war, these territorials, trained quite regularly every other Saturday night, typically. They also attended annual camp where the various companies of these battalions would train together. And it is interesting to note that more often than not, they never trained at battalion level, and they most definitely didn't train at brigade level. So a lot of this was brand new for these troops. So typically in the past, you would have the Essex Regiment, they would be training together, but one company would be in a different town over the region, over that county. It was quite interesting that as early as the 31st of July 1914, there was talk happening that war was on the horizon. One letter from an officer, and I haven't got his name, actually talking about the mobilization orders, and he remarked, quote, "Public notices were being posted that everyone approaching the Seaplay station at Jaywick ran a risk of being shot by sentries. This, together with certain departures from the camp of officers to regular units, and the fact that we had to find armed guards with ball ammunition, led us to realise that this might be a long 15 days camp." And it was definitely going to be a long 15 days camp. It was going to be a 4.5-year war. The camp was struck. The red coats, the scarlet jackets they would have been dressed in at the time were packed away and sent to store. The regimental reserves of ammunition were being distributed. This is as early as the 1st of August 1914. And each man was issued with an ID disc, given his name, rank, regiment, and serial number. War was on the horizon. At midnight on the 4th of August 1914, Britain, as we know, declared war on Germany. The following day, all the territorial units were mobilised for full-time war service and moved to their allotted positions across East Anglia. On the 20th of August, the 54th Division moved to northeast Norfolk, where the HQ in Norwich was set up. I think it was then moved to Bury St Edmunds. However, the division's role, just to be clear, was going to be defence of England only in case of invasion. In October 1914, the battalions were then asked if they wanted to volunteer for overseas service. It became somewhat of a surprise, I think, to some, that they actually assumed that they would be fighting overseas with the regular battalions and fighting the Germans, and they wouldn't be used for home defence only. So this encouraged over 75% who immediately volunteered for this overseas service. In November of that year, mentioned before, the 54th Division lost the Cambridgeshire Regiment, the Herts and the Suffolks that went to regular divisions, and a lot of the others were ready to go to war. When and ready, the 54th would be ready to leave shores for overseas. The Western Front was not going to be the location, and I think for a lot of the soldiers, they were a little bit disappointed about that. They heard in early August that it was potentially going to be the Dardanelles. Early July, beg your pardon, 1915 this was, that it was going to be the Dardanelles. Between the end of 1914 and then, it was all training and getting the division and the different battalions up to scratch. Many of them didn't know where the Dardanelles were, so of course had to check their maps. Within a few days, they were deprived of their thick woolen khaki drill jackets and issued khaki drill uniforms, as you can see from this photograph, and the Wolseley pattern of sun helmet. It was a warm summer actually in East Anglia during July 1915, so it was much appreciated. What they probably didn't know was the summers in Gallipoli in Turkey were going to be much warmer than a Bury, a Watford or a Colchester. And off they went to war. Lovely song here. Here's the blooming Essex, all pride and no money. I won't be singing this tonight, thankfully. You're probably crying out there. But it's quite an interesting song, and it was adopted by many of the battalions. What they did, for example, was swap out the name for "We Are the Essex Boys" to, for example, "We Are the Cheshire Boys," "We're the Bedford Boys," the Durhams, etc. And I understand that this this poem, this song, was also sung by the Everton Football Club. So quite interesting that there's a different version as well for that, up until the current day almost. Some photographs here, some in their standard sort of khaki serge uniforms. There are 3 officer groups. On the left-hand side, we have the 1st, 5th Norfolk Battalion. On the top right, we have the 1st, 5th Suffolks, and the bottom we have the 1st, 6th Essex. And they all left for Gallipoli on the 19th of July, 1915. They sailed predominantly from 2 ports, Liverpool and Devonport. The first ships reached the Greek islands of Lemnos on the 6th of August 1915. And that is an important date, as many of you will know, because that's the night where the August offensive was going to begin. Desperately needing reinforcements, Major General Inglefield's 54th Division was going to land at Suvla Bay, and they were instructed to land on the 10th of August 1915. There's a picture there of Gallipoli for those who are not familiar with it. Of course, we're talking about August offensive now. The April landings have already happened. They came after the failure of the naval attacks in February and March 1915. We had the 3 battles of Krithia down on the Hellas front, all sadly ending in failure. Similarly, in the Anzac area, they tried their best to break out at the end of April and May 1915, and some smaller operations in June 1915, and pretty much stalemate. So a new plan was put together with a huge amount of reinforcements, which was then to open the August offensive, which primarily was going to be an Anzac-led breakout over the Surrey Bear Heights. You can see in the middle of the map there, at the narrowest part of the peninsula. They were going to cut across the peninsula, capture the town of Mados, you can see, capture the Kilidbar Plateau, and take the forts from behind. Supporting that attack would be Lieutenant General Stopford's 9th Corps, all British, which would be a mix of Kitchener battalions and territorial battalions that would land at Suvla Bay, the 54th Territorials being part of that, to supply the manpower to push through, capture Suvla, and push through and cut the peninsula in 2. So I said Hamilton needed men for this. So Kitchener sent him the 10th Irish Division, the 11th Northern Division, and the 13th Western Division. All of these were Kitchener's new army. Remember the poster with his finger pointing at you, we need you now. And they were supplemented by 2 territorial divisions, the 54th, the subject of the talk, also the 53rd Welsh Division, and the Mounted Division. Now, just to mention, the Mounted Division were without their horses. The voyage out to Gallipoli was in style. They were aboard on most of them. You have the 1st, 5th Norfolks and the Suffolks. They were on board the SS Aquitania, which was a sister ship to the Mauretania and Lusitania. It was an eventful voyage for them. There were some heavy storms, and the 5th Norfolks, I believe, lost 2 of their machine guns, which was pretty damaging to them, almost a court-martial offence. They were not strapped down properly onto the deck, and they went over the side. So a great loss. One of the biggest fears, I think, on that journey out was submarines. And during the voyage, the Aquitania was actually attacked by a German submarine. But thankfully for them and the 2 battalions aboard, the torpedoes missed. The destroyers then escorting the convoy chased them off. There was also another sub-attack, actually by an Austro-Hungarian submarine, or U-boat as they're called, that had fired, and I don't understand why, fired what was reported as a wooden torpedo. I'm not sure if this was done on purpose, but of course the wooden torpedo hit the ship, didn't explode because it was for training, and thankfully the ship didn't sink. Now, what is quite interesting is who was commanding that U-boat at the time. I don't know if you recognize that photograph. Georges von Trapp, yes, from The Sound of Music. The character the film was based on was a submarine, Austro-Hungarian U-boat commander, submarine commander. That, of course, is the actor the wonderful Christopher Plummer, and this is the real George von Trapp there. So a little bit of a sub-story, which is quite interesting. It's also just actually going back to the what we believe was the German submarine attack. Is one of the stewards actually panicked, collapsed on deck, and they actually jumped over the side of the ship, which wasn't good for the ship's crew to do that. And again, you know, it wasn't a great way of showing morale there to the other people aboard the ship. When the two torpedoes missed, they managed to fish him out of the water, and he was being heavily reprimanded until one of the other crew members tapped the officer on his shoulder and said, could you just go a little bit easy on him? He was actually on the Lusitania and went down with that ship in May 1915. So he had survived one torpedo attack, and the poor boy, he didn't. You know, he was probably petrified and thought he'll go down on the second ship. Thankfully, he didn't, and he went on to survive the war. So a few little hiccups there on the journey out, but they managed to get offshore Suvla by the 10th of August. What you see in this photograph is the Essex Brigade, or actually one Essex battalion, landing. And what this shows are two lighters, and each of those would take up to 500 men each. So roughly 1,000 men per battalion with their officers. You're talking about landing a complete battalion in one wave. So a huge success, I suppose, from the failures of the April landings when they came ashore in wooden rowing boats, very slowly, unarmored, with no more than 30 men in. So, you know, throughout the whole of Gallipoli, we're always learning lessons and always looking at where we can improve. Unfortunately, you know, the improvements that enabled the Essex and other brigades to get ashore pretty much in one shape wasn't going to be the end of the story. And of course, there's other failures that unfortunately overall caused the campaign to fail. And this sort of unknownly to the Essex and the Suffolks and the Norfolks and the Isle of Wight Rifles, etc., was going to be one of their first battle honours, the landing at Suvla. So one to add to their regular battalions, especially the Suffolks and Norfolks, who had already been fighting on the Western Front, who had other battle honours such as Le Cateau, Neuve Chapelle and Ypres 1915. A Beach being one of the three designated beaches, and it was rather a mess. The men that landed in the first wave on A Beach had orders to get ashore at like 10 o'clock and then move inland for 2 miles in an easterly direction to fill a gap in the line between the 10th Irish to the north and the 53rd Welsh. I'm just going to read a letter now from a Captain Walton, who was 1st 5th Suffolk Regiment, and he's writing to his parents about the landing. And he wrote, "We landed on the peninsula the same day that I wrote you my last letter, and went up the same night when it was dark, and took up our position in the reserve trenches. We occupied these for 2 days. You have no idea of the heat here. It is something tremendous, but the nights are not so cold as we are led to believe. But I always wear my body belt, which is a fine protection. This is a veritable Dixieland, as nearly all water is manhandled about in Dixies, military saucepans. But the engineers are now boring wells. But at present there is certain dearth of water, as the enemy has poisoned a lot of the wells previously existing. The Turks have not got much artillery, and their shrapnel does not seem to have the beaten zone which ours possess. It is awfully interesting watching our fleet bombard the Turkish trenches, and I'll come back to the second part of the letter a little bit later on. So the situation so far, the 10th and 11th Irish Divisions were ashore on the night of the 6th and 7th of August. They had been fighting almost non-stop and pretty much exhausted, short of ammunition and short of water. The Anzacs, a little bit further south, in the Anzac the southern part of the Suvla battlefield, despite their early successes, were quickly running out of steam and under very serious threat of counterattack. During the 8th and 9th of August, as soon as the 53rd Welsh Division, the other territorials, had landed, they had been fed almost piecemeal into an action to try and recapture a hill called Scimitar Hill, another disaster that literally destroyed that division in one day. And into this mess, the 54th Division would land. And they've got Wharton there, I just read the letter from. Welsh lambs to the slaughter, and very much they were. They're only ashore, as I say, a day, and 2 of their 4 brigades were hurried into this sort of piecemeal battle to support the forward elements on Scimitar Hill and W Hills close by. It was really failure, as a Captain Arthur Crookenden from HQ said later. He said failure was caused by the entire lack of organisation of the attack, hurry which was quite unnecessary, exhaustion of men who had no food, and worst of all, no water. Pretty damning stuff. And the result was the needless destruction of a whole division, which left really none of them to support or exploit any other success. Compton Mackenzie wrote in his diary on the 9th of August, he said, "There is still no good news of 9th Army Corps. I'm afraid they've ruined the show. It's absolutely damnable. Dornay, who was almost weeping when he came back from Suvla today. There were only 800 Turks and we had more than 15,000 men facing them. They actually bathed. If this is Kitchener's army, and the best 3 divisions at that, give me the good old territorials any day," which is interesting. To high praise for the territorials. The 53rd Welsh, unfortunately, had been slaughtered, and it was now time for the 54th Division to go into the line. It is important, and Hamilton realised that he didn't want the 54th to go to the same way as the 53rd. So he ordered that the 54th would be held back and only sanctioned for use if ordered by GHQ directly. However, this is exactly what did not happen. At 10 o'clock at night on the 10th of August, Stopford, concerned about a gap in the line to the right of the 10th Division, ordered forward 6 battalions of the 54th. I'll just mark that on the map for you. Can you see that yellow arrow? And you've got those black lines to the north. That's the 10th Irish Division on Kerrish Tepe. And to the right, you can see the word Sitwell, and there you've got part of the 11th Division. So into that gap, the 54th was put, and you can obviously understand why he needed to put men there quickly. Because if the Turks found out there's a gap there, they could have exploited that and pushed through. You know, bear in mind, these poor 54th, they had barely left England, what is it, 2 weeks previous to this? They had been inoculated aboard the ships from various diseases, including typhoid, which has got a kick of the mule, so they weren't in best shape. And they went ashore with barely one water bottle, and each water bottle at the time would take about 1.5 pints. So really, there's nothing to wash with, nothing to cook with. That was all to drink. Some of the soldiers, bad water discipline, had already consumed their bottles before they went into the front line and went into this attack, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But they were a new hope, and they had a huge ask for this Royal Territorial Division that was barely ashore one day. So a bit of chaos there. Stopford spent, this is General Stopford, who was commanding 9th Corps, spent most of the 11th of August reorganising his battalions ashore. He'd pushed forward the 54th into the line and trying to gather together as many of the scattered units as possible to show good strength and allow a further attack to happen. Stopford explained the reasons for the delay to Hamilton, and he kept claiming he didn't have artillery and he did not want to enter into what he says, quote, a regular battle without his guns. But as we know, what does he have? A good 15,000 men, actually more with the 54th for sure, almost 25,000 by that stage, against the Turks, who had barely more than 800. He argued with Hamilton even before seeing the 54th Division in action, that both his territorial divisions were nothing but sucked oranges, and that they were not up to the job. Hamilton was furious and wrote, "He tells me straight and without any beating about the bush. I'm sure they would not secure the hills with any amount of guns, water and ammunition, assuming ordinary opposition, as the attacking spirit was absent, chiefly owing to the want of leadership by officers." Hamilton could not accept this assessment and insisted that the attack must take place. As to the want of leadership, being absent, and most of the Welsh officers we already know were already dead or wounded lying on the battlefield from the last Boche attack here at Suvla. Acknowledging that Stopford had made sort of no preparations for the attack, Hamilton decided that he had to delay this attack because throwing the 54th in wouldn't have done any good. Hamilton also, just to be fair to him, was unaware of the scale of the defeat that were facing Stopford's men. He believed that there was a chance rather to try and pry the heights of the Teke Tepe ridge from the Turks, believing that there were only 800 men. However, there were not, because during the night of the 10th of August, the 8th, 9th and 10th of August, the Turkish reserves came up, and there was probably a good division, not 800 men, of fresh troops facing him. So would Stopford's suck oranges make any difference? GHQ ordered Stopford to use the 54th Division to capture the Teke Tepe ridge on the dawn of the 12th of August, and this would be a night advance. Recent aerial reconnaissance, which, as we know, was out of date, showed little resistance and minimal entrenchments, but this was not the case by the morning of their attack. The attack was going to be spearheaded by the 54th Territorials, while Stopford's other forces would provide a supporting role. This was really madness. They were a raw division in all senses of the imagination, and worse still, they had no maps. They had no chance to reconnoitre the ground ahead of them, and all they really were ordered to do was advance to contact, meaning you advance through that gap and you advance until you get shot at, and then you dig in, secure that position, consolidate that position, and wait for the Turks to attack you. They needed support of the Welsh, but again, we understand that they were badly mixed up, heavy casualties and a lot of wounded. General Lindley actually wrote, Lindley was the 53rd Welsh Divisional Commander, wrote about the great difficulty he had in trying to organise his brigades. He said, quote, "The Cheshires and the North Wales brigades are in an awful muddle owing to so many officers having been killed or wounded, and the men are lost without them. The NCOs seem powerless and carry no authority. The officers have done wonderfully well, freely exposing themselves to get their men on, but have suffered heavy casualties." For this attack, the 54th would be basically going in alone. This is the map of the ground. You can see Suvla Bay there to the left, and towards the middle of the page, you've got point 28, which was a high point. Well, not really a high point, basically 28 feet there above sea level. And you've got the deployment there of the forward brigades. You've got the 5th Norfolks there to the south, the 8th Hampshires, the Isle of Wight Rifles, the 5th Suffolks, and the 4th Norfolks. And their attack was to start off from this point, advance through the gap, over the Chunuk Anafata plain, towards where you see those trench lines. And that's a little bit misrepresentative, really, because there weren't really any Turkish trench lines at that time. At best, there were ditches being utilised for trenches. They were ordered to advance through that, and hopefully, their contact would be on the foothills. You can see there on the extreme right-hand side. But for the majority of the battalions in that brigade, they're only going to march to the squares, which were military square 118, square I, N and S, you can see marked out there on the extreme right. And the shaded one, I, was where that brigade was, aiming for, Would they get that far? We'll find out in a few minutes. Now, leading this attack, there's a few sort of late changes. And this is quite interesting because it does show you what leadership was like at the time. The brigade commander was a Brunker, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Brunker. He was actually not relieved of his command straight away. He would actually go from Suvla basically a few days later, but he stood back from being brigade commander and he handed that over to Lieutenant Colonel Sir Horace Proctor Beecham, who was the 5th Norfolk's commander at the time. Sir Horace Proctor Beecham was going to lead not only his battalion, but the rest of the brigade, the Suffolks, the 4th Battalion, the Norfolks, and the Hants as well. The bombardment was going to be quite light. One, because they didn't know where the Turkish positions were, and they were going to advance with the help of a few Gurkha regiments, so a few Gurkha sniper groups, New Zealanders and Australians who were going to help the 54th sort of clear the ground of snipers. The ground in front of the brigade was pretty much flat. It's very cultivated for those who've been to Suvla today, interspersed by ditches, dry watercourses, and there's a few clumps of trees and scattered farm buildings around. So nothing really there to prevent the advance. It started quite early on. The advance started really successfully, but soon during the afternoon, it sort of veered off to the right-hand side. And what you find is the 1st, 5th Norfolks start veering off to the right because they have arguably less resistance than those on the left. They got ahead of a lot of their other battalions. And at one stage, they had to stop to wait for the Hampshires and the Suffolks to catch up with them. So you can imagine this sort of fragmented affair happening quite soon. So they're sort of losing their regimental sort of structured company groupings as they advanced. It was a very, very hot day as well. And they managed to get probably almost the good half a kilometre, if not a kilometre, before they came against heavy Turkish resistance. You had Turkish shrapnel fire falling down in amongst the advancing troops. You also had rifle fire, predominantly from snipers who were hidden themselves in bushes, in scrub, hidden themselves in trees as well, and from long range firing from back on the Teke Tepe ridge. You had the commanders, you had Proctor Beecham, Captain Randall Cubitt, cheering their men on, spurring their men on, waving the cane. There's one account of Proctor Beecham with his Raymac over his right-hand side, his cane in his left hand, shouting, on the Norfolks, come on, my holy boys, forward the hungry ninth, the ninth being the Norfolk's original pre-1881 title, the Ninth Foot. Good old Sandringham you hear, and a lot of other encouragement from their officers to get them forward. But it was, absolute mayhem. Those on the left were stopped by Kidney Hill. Those on the right, particularly the 1st, 5th Norfolks and a few stragglers from the Suffolks and Isle of Wight Rifles, advanced much further and probably got to a good kilometre and a half to what's described as a forest. It wasn't really, it was just a woodland, and also a village, which was more a collection of sort of rubble stone buildings. And you see one example there in the photograph. They became pretty fragmented, heavy casualties at that stage. A lot of the officers had been wounded or killed, and you almost had this last stand action by the Norfolks, the 1st, 5th, and many of them sort of fell in around those areas. On a recent battlefield tour, we found quite a lot of spent 303 cartridge ammunition in those areas, which gives you an example of the fighting that had happened there. One officer, Roland Perry, A Company, 1st, 5th Norfolks, he said, for some reason or mistake, no regiment, of which there were loads, backed us up to shove us through. We were opposed by a wall of bullets and we were knocked over right and left. I got too far ahead, lost my way trying to find it again, was bagged by a Turkish sniper, which swarm at very close range. The bullet broke my lower jaw, tore my tongue in shreds, and then exited through my right cheek. Then after an awful wandering, the RAMC got me by 11 p.m. and thankfully, he survived. Awful wound, but managed to get that patched up and invalided out of the army and made his way home. Um, Captain Hubert Walton, I mentioned him already, 1st Suffolk, said, then the advance took place, our regiment in part of the front line. Talk about the fog of war. Nobody knows what is happening to the right or the left, and very soon all connection was lost. Our chaps did awfully well. As for my platoon, I absolutely loved them, and some of my men would insist on keeping with me. Well, a group of us got to a place in advance where we decided to organise a defence. At first, there were not too many of us, but driblets of men of all regiments in the brigade came to reinforce us. You should just hear us cheer and wave our helmets when 2 machine guns came up, entirely manhandled. Although under a decent fire, everybody was as cool as a cucumber. Cigarettes and thirst quenchers were passed round without distinction of rank. For on the battlefield, a lot of officer and man are one. So the lot of officer and man are one. A wonderful letter, and it shows you how together, his platoon was definitely, something that I think is kind of common in a lot of those other territorial battalions, and regulars and other volunteer battalions as well. So total confusion there. You can see one of the huts and sort of inside of that. So this is where, and I won't go and dwell too much on the 5th Norfolks and talk about UFOs and little green men and the like. But what is quite interesting is that fog of war. And of course, lots of stories and rumours stem from these, this fog of war, which I think leads to the whole battalion. And you talk about the whole battalion being missing. And a lot of this was perpetuated by Sir Ian Hamilton after the war, as many of you know, because of the royal connection, the Sandringham estate. The royal family at the time wanted to find out what happened to people like Captain Beck, who was one of the lead gardeners, and the men that served with him under his company at the time. So, haven't got the time to go into that to a lot of detail, but there's some good books about it. There's a good book coming out. I've just been proofreading by Steve Smith, which will hopefully be out in the new year, which is going to unravel a lot of these myths and tell the true story. The fighting parson. So one first fifth Suffolk Reverend was a Charles Pierpont Edwards, and he became known as the fighting parson. I think it's because back home in the UK, I think he was curating London East End, a tough patch to curating. He used to settle disputes with his fists. So I'm not sure how many clergymen do that today, but he always wanted to show, quote, his muscular Christianity. How wonderful is that? He was actually in this attack and was awarded the Victoria Cross, beg your pardon, the Military Cross for his gallantry during the attack on the 12th of August. He actually came back to Gallipoli after the war and served with the Graves registration units, and actually was instrumental in finding the 5th Norfolks and what happened to the bodies that weren't accounted for after the battle. And I think this is where a lot of the the rumours actually stem from. And part of that battlefield trip, he found Captain Frank Beck for the Sandringham estate. He's found his gold watch, I believe a checkbook and a few other personal items and evidence that he was killed in action there. And this was presented back to, so I believe it stayed in the family, and it was actually shown to Queen Alexandra, because the actual watch was given from her to, I believe, Sir Dighton Probyn VC, who won his VC in the Indian Mutiny, who then in turn gave that to Frank Beck. So a good, rich story about that. But the bodies were found, including 2 identified soldiers, a Corporal Barnaby and a Walter Carter, who were identified by their identity discs, and their bodies brought in and buried in Asbach Cemetery. But unfortunately, a lot of the other bodies, around 250 in total, couldn't be identified, but were buried in that cemetery. So that was 163 Brigade's attack, but other brigades were also used at Suvla. You had the Essex Regiment. They fought up on Kerridge Tepe, and you've got a nice photograph there in support of the Irish Regiment. The Irish Division, the 10th Irish there. And, that was a pretty tough battlefield to fight on. And they did pretty well in their baptism of fire in one of the attacks on Kidney Hill around the 15th and 16th of August 1915. Again, they thought they were being confronted by 3 companies of the Gallipoli gendarme battalions, but unfortunately for them, it was actually 2 brigades. The 10th Irish did wonderfully well that day and captured almost a kilometre of ground in some of the hardest terrain Gallipoli has to offer. The 54th went in support, but unfortunately, despite being fresh and raw troops, they couldn't really do much apart from, take the brunt of the fighting, and lots of them were killed, including the fellow there, Lieutenant Cyril Richard Lydecker, 1st Bedford Regiment, who died, and his brother, the quartermaster, was wounded and went on, I think, to actually dine in Egypt a year later. But it wasn't through the bravery, it wasn't through the lack of bravery of the officers and men of the Bedfordshires and also the London battalions that were part of that brigade. So of the casualties, there was a lot there, a lot being killed. Lieutenant Alan Hardin, Finsbury Rifles, leaves up a lovely diary, and I haven't got time to read all of this, but he talks about the aftermath of that Kidney Hill attack. He wrote in his diary, "That night, the aftermath of the battle was terrible. I remember the tremendous crash of rifles and machine gun fire close to, and the thump of bullets and sparks flying from the stones, while an officer, sergeant, and 6 of us pushed through the scrub towards the curve of the hill, which showed up darkly against the night sky. Bursts of fire, and silence was broken by the agonizing cries that will always haunt me. Seemingly from all that the hill, there was the cries of ambulance, stretcher bearers, ambulance, or oh damn you, my leg's broken, and then stretcher bearers. It was horrible. We would start from a voice, and the voice would then cease. Then another voice start further away would then begin. The hillside was a shambles. Evidently there had been a fierce hand-to-hand fight there only a few hours ago. Rifles, kits, water bottles, khaki Turkish tunics and headgear were strewn everywhere amongst the scrub. One of their commanders, Brigadier General de Winton, and this is interesting, a senior officer there, leading from the front. You don't hear of that much, in front of his territorials there, trying to capture the hill. His brigade would suffer 37 officers and 900 men lost from that brigade. That's probably almost half of that brigade at that time. The Bedfords, we saw Lydecker, they would lose 14 officers and 300 men. Quite a total. A little over 2 weeks ashore at Suvla, the 54th Division were on the move again, or what was left of them. On the 15th of August, Hamilton had actually sacked Stopford because of the failure of Suvla, and replaced him with Sir Julian Byng. Remember him? He was a divisional commander for the 54th back in 1910. But unfortunately, despite being a very capable senior officer and command and corps commander, he could change little by the time he arrived. There were more sackings. Not only Stopford went, but the 10th Divisional Commander, Mahon, he resigned due to personality issues with other commanders there at Suvla. The 11th Divisional Commander, Hammersley, was sacked. And actually, I think every single one of his brigade commanders as well. The 53rd Divisional Commander, the Territorial Division, the Welsh, Lindley resigned. Quote, he wrote, on the grounds that his division had gone to pieces and that he did not feel it in himself to pull it together. Powerful words. 54th Divisional Commander, good old friend Inglefield. Unfortunately, he was too old for Gallipoli. It was a young man's war and he went sick, and unfortunately he had to be evacuated off. So where did they move? They left Suvla, they went to Anzac, and we've got a map there of their new area. So they're fighting side by side with the Australians and New Zealanders. You get some wonderful trench names there from the East Anglian region. Norfolk Street, you can probably make out. Hatfield Park, Bedford Gully, West Ham Gully, Romford Street. And a lot of those trenches you can still find today. And we ventured there last May on our battlefield tour. So interesting places there that they named after, home. Not only the battlefield had changed, but also the political scene had changed. The writing was on the wall. By August, September 1915, troops are being moved to Salonika to open up a new front there, as neutral Bulgaria, came into the war on the Axis side. To aid Greece, what Kitchener had to do, he ordered Hamilton to send both French and at least one British division, which was the 10th Irish, and they went out to Salonika, which really weakened those in the Gallipoli front. And of course, so that already, the writing was really on the wall for the Gallipoli campaign at that stage. The 54th were becoming veterans in their own way. They had attached to them one of the mounted brigades. They had the Suffolk Yeomanry, the Norfolk Yeomanry, and the Welsh Horse. We've got a photograph there of that's Major Honourable Edward Cardigan, who served alongside the likes of Walter Guinness and Lord Rothschild, and again, he writes a fantastic book. His letters are published and well worth getting. Too much to cover today, but some great praise of the 54th Division, its officers, in particular the Norfolk guys as well. So that mounted brigade went into support. Nice little trait sign there. Believe it or not, that was found quite recently on the battlefield. Norfolk Yeomanry machine gun position, I think that says, or something along those lines. And you had, I would say, live and let live type approach to Gallipoli. There was rumour that they were going to attack Hill 60, and the 54th Division went into the line at Hill 60, but the attack never really happened. It became more like trench warfare and tunnel warfare, where the war went from trenches underground. And for those who's been out there, you can still see the mine craters on the Hill 60 area. And there you go, you've got a photograph there of the ground sort of running down from the heights of the Damajalik spur towards Hill 60, which became, quite a hot area for the 54th Division, and quite a hot area in terms of bombing attacks as well. It wasn't just tunnelling, it was bombing, and a lot of casualties were caused by bomb attacks and mining attacks as well. So what of casualties and what of sickness? It wasn't so much combat casualties. You can see there by taking a slice. And there's some really good information in the battalion war diaries for the Essex Regiment and their secondary source material in terms of their unit histories. And you get an idea there of the casualties. Enemy actions for those months was only 146 between September, October, November. But you can see the amount of sickness there, quite high. A wastage of around 120 men per week. That equates to 75% casualties. So whilst dysentery plagued the summer, really, As the winter came in, you got people suffering from frostbite, a bit of enteritis as well, and also jaundice. The numbers were dwindling. They were demoralized as well. Believe it or not, 3 men did desert. I don't know where you desert from on Gallipoli. They were eventually found later and reunited with their battalions. They were not shot, and they don't seem to have been given a field court martial either. So interesting. As the winter came and like an Indian summer came, the flies went away. Morale also increased as well as they got towards the end of the campaign, which is good. There's also one really amusing incident during September, October, when the troops spotted a large flock of geese migrating over the trenches. And it was a really boring day in the trenches, so the war diary goes. So one soldier started taking pot shots at these geese. Suddenly it was 2, then it was 5, then it was 8, then it was a whole battalion, then it was a whole brigade. Even the Turks joined in as well and started firing at these poor geese. Luckily for the geese, not a single one was hit, and they all flew over no man's land, and no one benefited from a nice early Christmas meal or anything along those lines. Rations became better. Um, During November, meat was being issued, around £1 per man, bread around £1, biscuits, flour, milk, rice. You had different varieties of jam, not just plum and apple and apricot, sugar, cheese, dried fruit, mustard, pepper. It was really, really improved. And of course, for the men, almost an endless supply of cigarettes. And where it was allowed, a half a gill of rum per man per day as well. So those winter stores really, really helped. Winter clothing came as well, and this helped because, of course, the British knew winter was coming as the campaign sort of came almost to a close in November. Heavy rains in November, as many of you know. We had snow. We had snow. They had snow out there in December as well. But on the whole, morale was good. Soldiers were having regular haircuts. They were washing regularly because water was available, and it was, not a bad place really for them to be. However, on December the 13th, 1915, the 54th Division left Gallipoli for good. They were evacuated to Mudros and then to Alexandria in Egypt. So were they the sucked oranges? Well, I suppose it can be observed that old generals did lack guts in a way, and new soldiers lacked experience, as the saying goes. But there's also a saying that you don't have bad soldiers, you just have bad officers. And maybe, some of that did ring true with the 54th Division. Certainly there was a lack of training and knowledge, and maybe a lack of self-confidence to push forward, just not knowing a modern war. And, this was so different to an old battlefield where many of them had no experience. These were civilians in a way, and very much Saturday night soldiers. Hamilton, Sir Ian Hamilton, attributed failure to the combination of Stopford's incompetence and with him and his senior commanders, but also the rawness of all of the troops that formed 9th Corps. Hamilton noted in his diary for the 10th of August that Stopford had criticised the attacking spirit of these troops, but Hamilton remarked, "The letter has driven me very nearly to my wit's end. Things cannot be so bad. None of us have any complaint at all of the new army troops, only their old army generals." Now, pretty scathing. And we do see elements of that within the 54th Division. Inglefield, 60-year-old, a very, very difficult battlefield. Maybe he was too old and unfit to command there. And he went sick twice, I think, during October. Brunker, who was brigade commander, he led from the back. And funny enough, 2 of his battalion commanders remarked that he was actually mentally unstable. Proctor Beecham of the 5th Norfolks, you can argue until the cows come home. He was a cavalry commander at the end of the day and really didn't know how to command infantry. 1st, 4th Norfolks, Lieutenant Lieutenant Colonel John Harvey basically relieved himself of command and passed that over to Major Hines, who led them into attack. So it's quite shocking, really, that a lot of these old generals weren't actually commanding and disappeared quite quickly. Of Harvey, one of the CEOs mentioned that neither Harvey nor Beecham were fit to lead a patrol of Boy Scouts, so pretty damaging and pretty scathing of them. But you have De Winton mention the attack on Kidney Hill, who did lead from the front. 12th of August, Hamilton wrote in his diaries, these stories about the troops, I do not accept them. The troops have lost heavily, but they are right if they were being led. I know quite well both territorial divisions, the 53rd and the 54th. I knew them in England, and it is to say, since they have had their eyes pecked out, they have been through the strainer, and the best officers and men and the best battalions have been serving for months in France. The 3 show battalions in the 54th are in France, and their places have been taken by the 10th and the 11th Londons and the 8th Hants. Essex is good, London is good, Hants is good, but the Trinity is not territorial. The same with the Welshmen. Yet, even so, taking the territorials as they are, a scratch lot, half strength, no artillery, not a patch upon the original divisions, as I inspected them in England 6 months ago, even so, they fight right enough and they are keen enough if they are set fair and square at their fence. It wouldn't be until the Battle of Gaza in 1917 that Inglefield's 54th Division would be finally vindicated. By the time they evacuated, the 54th Division totaled only 240 officers and just over 4,400 other ranks, little more than a third of strength. In 1916, they went on to protect the Suez Canal, fighting the Senussi before being transferred to Palestine under General Allenby. In 17, as mentioned, they fought in the first, second, and third Battle of Gaza and the Battle of Jaffa against the old enemy, Johnny Turk. In 1918, they continued to fight in Palestine and fought in the Battle of Megiddo, I believe in September, and they advanced to Haifa. The 54th actually ended the war during the Turkish armistice in Beirut on the 31st of October, when that was signed out in the Middle East, and they were eventually demobbed in 1919. I just want to leave you with a quote from an officer in the Essex Regiment, and I just want to read this out to you, who observed, he said, the troops were absolutely fit on leaving England, but looking upon their training in light of the after experience, I think it may have failed somewhat in teaching officers to use their own initiative sufficiently. We were too inclined to expect clear and full orders, and these were naturally could not get in the early days of Gallipoli. They were essential, however, with enthusiastic but inexperienced troops. Enthusiastic, the 54th probably were. Inexperienced, yes, that they were definitely inexperienced. Sucked oranges, no, they're definitely not. By the time they left the Gallipoli and fought at Gaza, they were veterans and good ones too. We will remember them, and thank you.